The mystery of the McDonald farm fires. In the winter of 1922, the rural landscape of Antigonish County in Nova Scotia was defined by its isolation. The region was composed of scattered farming communities where neighbors relied on one another for survival against the harsh Canadian elements. One of these communities was Caledonia Mills, a place where news traveled slowly and folklore often held as much weight as written law. It was here, on a remote farmstead owned by Alexander MacDonald, that a series of events unfolded which would baffle local authorities, terrify the residents, and eventually draw the attention of international researchers. The incidents did not begin with a grand spectacle, but started quietly, almost imperceptibly, within the walls of the MacDonald family home. The household consisted of Alexander MacDonald, a man in his 70s who was well regarded in the community for his stoic nature and hard work. Living with him was his wife, whose name appears less frequently in the records, but who shared the burden of managing the farm, and their adopted daughter, Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen was 15 years old at the time the disturbances began. She had been with the MacDonalds for several years, having been taken in to help with chores and to provide companionship for the aging couple. By all accounts, life on the farm was routine and uneventful, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the demands of the livestock. There was no history of trouble at the property, no previous reports of vandalism, and no known enemies who would wish the family harm. The peace of the farm was shattered on the evening of the 14th of January, 1922. The family had settled in for the night, the wood stove providing the only source of heat against the bitter cold outside. According to later testimony given by Alexander, the first sign that something was wrong was a sudden, inexplicable sound from the attic. It was described not as the settling of old timber or the scratching of rodents, but as a heavy, deliberate thudding, as if someone were walking across the floorboards above them. Alexander went to investigate, carrying a lantern up the narrow stairs. The attic was used for storage and was filled with the usual assortment of farm equipment and old furniture. Upon inspection, he found nothing out of place. There were no footprints in the dust other than his own, and the windows were latched tight from the inside. He returned downstairs, assuming the wind had caused a loose board to rattle. 2 days later, on January 16, the phenomena escalated from auditory disturbances to physical manifestations. The family was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when they noticed smoke curling up from a corner of the room. Alexander rushed over to find a piece of wallpaper smoldering. There was no nearby heat source. The stove was on the other side of the room, and no lamps were lit in that specific corner. He patted the fire out with a damp cloth, bewildered by how it could have started. Before the family could process what had happened, Mary Ellen cried out from the parlor. Another fire had started there, this time consuming a cushion on the sofa. The fire was extinguished quickly, but the atmosphere in the house shifted immediately from confusion to fear. Over the next few days, the frequency of the fires increased dramatically. The MacDonalds found themselves living in a state of siege, unable to sleep or leave the house unguarded. Fires would erupt in impossible locations. Wet towels hanging on a rack would suddenly burst into flames. Curtains would ignite while family members were standing just a few feet away. In one instance, Alexander reported checking a pile of firewood that had been brought in from the snow. The wood was damp and cold, yet moments later, tongues of blue flame were seen dancing along the bark. When he threw water on it, the fire hissed and went out, but the wood itself showed no deep charring, as if the fire was consuming a fuel source that wasn't there. The community of Caledonia Mills was close-knit, and word of the troubles at the MacDonald farm spread quickly. Neighbors initially suspected that perhaps the old man was becoming careless with his pipe or that the chimney was faulty. A group of local men, including a neighbor named Dan McGillivray, decided to visit the farm to offer assistance and, privately, to see if they could determine the cause of the fires. They arrived expecting to find a rational explanation, perhaps a cracked flue or a hidden draft. What they witnessed left them as shaken as the family. During their visit, while everyone was gathered in the main room discussing the situation, a fire broke out in an upstairs bedroom. The men rushed up to put it out. No sooner had they returned downstairs than smoke was spotted coming from the cellar. The nature of the fires defied standard physics, according to the witnesses. They were often described as having a low temperature initially, allowing fabrics to be handled even while they were burning before suddenly intensifying. The flames were sometimes blue or pale yellow, distinct from the orange glow of a wood fire. One witness, a skeptical farmer from a neighboring property, watched as a rug in the center of an empty room began to smoke. He testified later that he had been watching the doorway and knew for a fact that no one had entered or thrown a match. The rug simply began to burn from the center outward. The psychological impact on the McDonalds was profound. They stopped undressing for bed, sleeping in their winter coats with buckets of water placed strategically around the house, terrified that they would burn to death in their sleep. As the fires continued, other phenomena began to manifest. Livestock in the barn were found in states of distress. Cows were found loose from their stalls, their ropes untied with complex knots that would be difficult for an animal to manipulate. On one occasion, the family found all the cattle moved to different stalls, a task that would take a single man nearly an hour to accomplish, yet it had seemingly happened in the span of a few minutes. Objects inside the house began to move on their own. Plates were swept off the table by unseen hands. A heavy churn was overturned in the pantry while the family was in the adjacent room. The escalating activity suggested a level of intelligence or intent focused on disrupting the daily life of the household. The situation became untenable, and Alexander MacDonald felt he had no choice but to involve the authorities. He contacted the local police, and eventually the case reached the ears of Detective Peleg Carroll. Carroll was a seasoned officer, experienced in dealing with theft and arson. He arrived at the MacDonald farm, determined to catch the culprit. His working theory was that someone in the family, or a malicious neighbor, was setting the fires to drive Alexander off his land. Carroll conducted a thorough search of the property. He looked for incendiary devices, chemicals, or hidden matches. He found nothing. He interviewed the neighbors, who vouched for Alexander's character and expressed their own bewilderment at what they had seen. During Detective Carroll's investigation, the phenomena did not cease. In fact, they seemed to occur with even greater frequency when observers were present. Carroll himself witnessed a fire start on a windowsill where there was nothing flammable but the wood itself. He also noted the peculiar behavior of the fires, which seemed to target specific personal items. Clothing belonging to the family would be found smoldering in closets. Bedding would catch fire in the center of the mattress. The detective was forced to admit that he could find no evidence of a crime in the traditional sense. There were no footprints in the snow leading up to the house during the times the fires started, ruling out an intruder. The fires occurred in rooms where the family members were present, but also in rooms that were verified to be empty. The relentless nature of the disturbance drew the attention of the press. Newspapers in Halifax and beyond began to run stories about the fire spook of Caledonia Mills. The sensational coverage brought a new wave of visitors to the farm, curiosity seekers, amateur sleuths, and spiritualists. The MacDonalds, private people by nature, found their home turned into a public spectacle. The stress was particularly hard on Mary Ellen. As the youngest member of the household, she became a focal point for the speculation. Some locals whispered that she was bedeviled or that she possessed the evil eye. In the folklore of the region, which was heavily influenced by Scottish Highland traditions, such events were often attributed to witchcraft or a curse. In an effort to find a solution, Alexander reached out to his priest. A mass was said in the house, and holy water was sprinkled in the corners of every room. For a brief period, the family hoped this would put an end to the terror. However, the respite was short-lived. A few days after the blessing, a fire broke out in the parlor with such intensity that it scorched the ceiling before it could be extinguished. This failure of religious intervention deepened the dread in the community. If neither the police nor the church could stop the fires, the residents felt they were dealing with something completely outside the bounds of their understanding. The fear was palpable, leading some neighbors to avoid the road that passed by the McDonald farm after dark. It was at this point that Dr. Walter Franklin Prince entered the narrative. Prince was a research officer for the American Society for Psychical Research. He was a man of science, known for debunking fraudulent mediums and exposing hoaxes. He heard about the Caledonia Mills case and was intrigued by the sheer volume of witness testimony corroborating the events. He traveled to Nova Scotia to conduct an independent investigation. Prince arrived at the farm with a critical eye, prepared to find a rational explanation involving phosphorus or sleight of hand. He interviewed the family separately, cross-referencing their stories to look for inconsistencies. He also spent days staying at the house, observing the family's routine. Dr. Prince's investigation focused heavily on the timeline of the fires and the location of the family members when they occurred. He created detailed charts of the house, marking where each fire had started. He noted that the majority of the incidents happened during the day or early evening, rarely late at night when the family was asleep. This pattern suggested a connection to the conscious activities of the household. He also observed Mary Ellen closely. In his notes, he described her as a quiet, somewhat timid girl who seemed genuinely terrified by what was happening. However, he also noted that she was often the first to discover the fires or was present in the room when they broke out. One of the most disturbing incidents recorded by Prince involved the physical assault of the family members. Mary Ellen claimed that she had been slapped by an unseen hand while walking down the hallway. On another occasion, she reported that her arm had been gripped tightly, leaving red marks that were visible to the investigators. Alexander McDonald also reported being pushed or shoved while working in the barn. These physical interactions added a layer of aggression to the haunting that had not been present in the early stages. It wasn't just about the fires anymore, it felt like a personal attack. The psychological strain on Mary Ellen was evident. She became withdrawn and jumpy, reacting to every creak of the floorboards. Dr. Prince eventually formulated a theory that aligned with the emerging parapsychological concepts of the time. He did not believe the house was haunted by the spirit of a deceased person. Instead, he suspected that Mary Ellen was the unconscious agent of the phenomena. He proposed that she was a poltergeist agent, a term used to describe an individual, usually an adolescent, whose repressed emotions or psychological stress manifested as physical energy. In Prince's view, Mary Ellen was not starting the fires with matches, but was causing them through some unknown psychokinetic mechanism. This theory was radical and difficult for the local community to grasp. To them, the choice was binary. Either she was setting the fires deliberately, or it was the work of the devil. Despite Prince's scientific approach, he could not offer a cure. He could only observe and document. He conducted experiments where he controlled the environment, removing all matches from the house and keeping Mary Ellen under constant supervision. Even under these controlled conditions, anomalies continued to occur. Small objects would be displaced, and the smell of smoke would drift through the hallways without a discernible source. Prince left the farm with a voluminous file of notes, but no solution for the McDonalds. His report would become a classic text in the study of poltergeist phenomena, but it offered little comfort to the family living in the freezing Nova Scotia winter with a house that seemed to want to consume them. The climax of the events came in late February. The family had exhausted themselves fighting the fires. The house was scarred with burn marks on the floors, walls, and furniture. They were living in a shell of a home, huddled in the kitchen for safety. The final straw was a fire that started in the middle of the night, igniting the bedding in the room where Alexander and his wife slept. They woke to the smell of burning wool and barely managed to smother the flames before they spread to the mattress. The realization that they could have been burned alive in their sleep broke their resolve. They could no longer stay in the house. Alexander MacDonald made the difficult decision to abandon the farm. It was a devastating choice. The farm was his livelihood, his legacy, and his only asset. To leave it meant financial ruin and homelessness. However, the safety of his family took precedence. They packed what few belongings they could, salvaged clothes that hadn't been scorched, some kitchenware, and personal documents, and moved in with a neighbor. The moment the family left the property, the fires ceased. The house stood empty and silent. Neighbors who checked on the property reported no further smoke or disturbances. The phenomena appeared to be inextricably linked to the presence of the family and specifically to Mary Ellen. The aftermath of the Caledonia Mills haunting was a slow tragedy for the MacDonald family. They were effectively refugees in their own community. While some neighbors were sympathetic, others remained suspicious. The stigma of the events followed them. Mary Ellen, in particular, bore the brunt of the social fallout. In the eyes of many, she was the cause of the trouble, whether she intended it or not. The concept of unconscious psychokinesis was not widely understood or accepted. To the farmers of Antigonish County, she was simply the girl who brought fire. She was eventually placed in a different home, separated from the MacDonalds, in hopes that a change of environment would stop the phenomena. Reports suggest that the disturbances did not follow her to her new residence, lending credence to the idea that the specific combination of the environment at the farm and her presence had been the catalyst. The MacDonald farmhouse itself became a local landmark of fear. For years, it stood abandoned, deteriorating under the weight of the snow and the neglect. Local children would dare each other to run up to the porch, but few ventured inside. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to watch the road. Stories persisted that on certain nights, a phantom glow could be seen in the upper windows, a memory of the fires that had driven the owners away. The farm was never re-inhabited by the MacDonalds. Alexander died some years later, never having returned to the home he had built. Years later, the house was destroyed by a final fire. This time, there was no mystery about the cause. It was simply the end of a structure that had been left to rot. But the legend of the fire spook remained. It became part of the oral history of Nova Scotia, a story told during long winter nights. The case remains one of the most well-documented poltergeist cases in Canadian history due to the involvement of the police, the insurance investigators, and Dr. Prince. The sheer number of witnesses, over 30 distinct individuals outside the family, makes it difficult to dismiss as a simple hoax. These were practical people, farmers and officers, who had no reason to invent such stories and every reason to want them to stop. One detail that often gets overlooked in the summaries of the case is the specific nature of the blue flames reported by Alexander. In modern fire investigation, blue flames can indicate the burning of specific gases or alcohols, but there were no such accelerants present in the MacDonald home. The blue flame remains one of the most scientifically puzzling aspects of the case. It suggests a combustion process that does not align with burning wood or cotton. Witnesses described the fire as having a fluid quality, moving over surfaces like a liquid rather than consuming them immediately like a normal flame. This detail was consistent across multiple accounts, from family members to the visiting neighbors. Another unresolved element is the missing time or confusion reported by Mary Ellen during the height of the activity. Dr. Prince noted that she often seemed dazed or in a trance-like state during the fires. She would stare blankly at the flames until someone shouted her name. At the time, this was interpreted as shock or fear. However, in retrospect, researchers have drawn parallels to other cases where the focal agent experiences a dissociation of consciousness. It raises the question of whether Mary Ellen was aware of what was happening on some level, or if she was a passenger in her own body, witnessing the destruction along with everyone else. The question of agency remains the central mystery. If Mary Ellen was unconsciously projecting this energy, what triggered it? Life on the farm was hard, but there were no reports of abuse or extreme trauma prior to the events. Was it the isolation, the pressure of her role in the household? Or was there something about the land itself combined with her presence that created a perfect storm? There are local legends in the area regarding the displacement of older settlements and the history of the land before the McDonalds arrived, but no direct correlation was ever proven. The hauntings seemed to exist in a vacuum, a sudden explosion of chaotic energy that burned itself out only when the family unit was dissolved. In the decades that followed, parapsychology moved on to other famous cases, but the Caledonia Mills incident remains unique for its intensity and the physical danger it posed. Most hauntings involve noises or cold spots. This one involved a very real threat to life and property. The fires were not hallucinations. They left ash and charred wood, they destroyed furniture and clothing, they forced a family to become homeless. The physical reality of the events sets it apart from more subjective ghost stories. The records from the insurance company, which refused to cover the damages due to the suspicious nature of the fires, still exist as a bureaucratic testament to the impossible situation the family faced. Today, the site of the McDonald farm is reclaimed by nature. Trees and brush have grown over the foundations. There is little to indicate that a house once stood there, let alone one that was the center of such a violent mystery. But in the local archives of Antigonish, the testimonies remain. The handwritten statements of the neighbors who saw wet towels burn, the police reports of Detective Carroll stating he could find no arsonist, and the detailed observations of Dr. Prince all paint a picture of a few weeks in winter where the laws of reality seem to suspend themselves. The story of the Caledonia Mills fire spook serves as a reminder of the fragility of domestic safety. The home is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of warmth and protection against the cold world outside. In January 1922, for Alexander McDonald and his family, the home became the predator. The fire that should have kept them warm turned against them. The walls that should have sheltered them became a trap. And in the center of it all was a teenage girl, terrified and confused, watching the world burn around her, unable to explain why or how. The incident is rarely discussed outside of Nova Scotia historical circles now. It lacks the cinematic flair of a horror movie villain or the clear narrative resolution of a mystery novel. There was no exorcism that worked. There was no culprit caught in a trap. There was just a family who lost everything to a force they couldn't name. It is a raw, unresolved account of human experience at the edge of the unknown. The ambiguity is what makes it enduring. We want to believe there was a trick, a hidden match, a clever deception. But the 30 witnesses, the scorched wood, and the blue flames suggest that just perhaps something else walked the floors of the McDonald farm that winter. Even the skeptics of the time were forced to pause. One local newspaper editorial from 1922 summed up the public sentiment. "We do not believe in ghosts. We do not believe in spirits. But we cannot explain what is happening at Caledonia Mills." That sentence captures the essence of the event. It was a collision between the rational, hard-working world of rural Canada and an inexplicable, destructive force. It sits in the history books as an anomaly, a question mark burned into the landscape of Antigonish County, waiting for an answer that will likely never come. The Caledonia Mills disturbance. The landscape of rural Nova Scotia in the early 20th century was defined by its harshness and its silence. In the winter of 1922, the community of Caledonia Mills, located deep within Antigonish County, was not the kind of place that welcomed outsiders or solicited attention. It was a farming settlement where families worked land that was often unforgiving, relying on generations of stoicism to get through the long, dark months of snow and ice. The farms were spread far apart, separated by dense thickets of spruce and fir trees that seemed to swallow sound. It was in this isolated environment that the MacDonald family lived. Their farmhouse was a standard timber structure built to withstand the Atlantic winds, but it would soon become the center of a series of events that defied the understanding of local authorities, insurance investigators, and the family themselves. The events would eventually force them from their home, leaving the property to rot back into the earth, but for a few weeks in January, the house became the focal point of a terrifying and unexplained siege. Alexander MacDonald was the head of the household, a man respected in the community for his hard work and his no-nonsense approach to life. He lived there with his wife and their adopted daughter, Mary Ellen, who was 15 years old at the time. There was nothing remarkable about the family dynamic on the surface. They were typical of the region, hardworking, religious, and quiet. They attended Mass, they tended their livestock, and they kept to themselves. The winter of 1922 had been particularly cold, freezing the ground solid and turning the roads into treacherous ruts of ice. The isolation was absolute. It was against this backdrop of frozen stillness that the first anomalies began to occur, small incidents that were easily dismissed at first as accidents or misplacements, but would soon escalate into a phenomenon that threatened their lives. The initial activity was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the normal creaks and settling of an old wooden house in winter. Alexander began to notice that objects in the house were not where he had left them. Tools would migrate from the barn to the kitchen, utensils would disappear from the table and reappear in the hallway. At first, he blamed his own memory or perhaps the clumsiness of the others, but the movement of objects soon became too deliberate to ignore. Heavy furniture, pieces that required significant effort to lift, would be found shifted inches from their original positions. Doors that had been securely latched would be found swinging wide open, letting the biting cold air fill the heated rooms. There was a sense of unease growing in the household, a feeling that they were not alone in the space, but there was no visual evidence of an intruder. The snow around the house remained unbroken by footprints, save for their own paths to the barn and the well. The situation escalated dramatically in mid-January. The family was sitting down for their evening meal when they heard a loud thud from the upper floor. It sounded as though a heavy sack of grain had been dropped directly onto the floorboards above their heads. Alexander went upstairs to investigate, carrying a kerosene lamp to light the way. The upper floor was empty. There was nothing out of place, no fallen objects, and no sign of anyone hiding in the shadows. He checked the windows. They were all painted shut with frost and age. Confused, he returned downstairs, but before he could sit, the sound repeated, this time from the parlor. It was the sound of a heavy, dull impact. The family began to realize that the house itself was turning against them. The atmosphere in the rooms changed, becoming heavy and charged with static, a sensation that often precedes a thunderstorm, yet it was the dead of winter. The phenomenon then shifted from auditory disturbances to something far more dangerous: fire. It began with small, inexplicable ignitions. A piece of wallpaper in the hallway would suddenly begin to smolder and curl, smoke drifting up toward the ceiling. There was no source of heat nearby, no stove, no lamp, no wiring. Alexander would rush to pat it out with his hands or a damp cloth. Minutes later, a curtain in a different room would catch fire. These were not roaring blazes initially, but small, localized combustions that seemed to target flammable materials within the home. The family was forced into a state of constant vigilance. They could not sleep. They had to patrol their own home in shifts, buckets of water at the ready, watching the walls for the telltale wisp of gray smoke that signaled the start of another outbreak. News of the trouble at the McDonald farm began to leak out to the surrounding community, despite the family's desire for privacy. Neighbors who stopped by to offer help or check on the livestock were witnesses to the chaos. One neighbor reported sitting in the kitchen and watching as a dish towel hanging on a rack far from the stove suddenly burst into flame. He watched Alexander douse it, only to have a calendar on the opposite wall ignite moments later. The fires were described as having a strange quality. They did not seem to spread as naturally as a normal fire. They would flare up intensely and then die down, or they would smolder in damp areas where a fire should not have been able to catch. The sheer frequency was exhausting. In a single day, the family and their neighbors extinguished over 30 separate fires within the house. The physical toll on Alexander and his wife was immense. They were living in a smoke-filled war zone, fighting an enemy they could not see or understand. The terror was not limited to the interior of the house. The barn, the lifeline of any farm, became a target. The livestock began to exhibit signs of extreme distress. The horses would kick at their stalls, their eyes rolling in panic, soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperatures. When Alexander went to check on them, he would find their tails braided. This was not the work of wind or chance. The braids were tight, complex knots that would have taken human hands considerable time to fashion. Yet, the barn had been locked, and the snow outside remained undisturbed. The cattle were moved from one stanchion to another, a task that would require significant force and cooperation from the animals, yet it happened in the span of minutes while the family was inside the house fighting fires. The phenomenon was demonstrating a level of physical control over the environment that was terrifyingly comprehensive. As the fires continued, the local authorities had to get involved. The situation had moved beyond a domestic curiosity to a matter of public safety. Officers were dispatched to the farm to investigate. These were practical men accustomed to dealing with theft, disputes, and the harsh realities of rural life. They arrived with the assumption that this was a case of arson, likely perpetrated by someone with a grudge or perhaps a member of the family seeking attention. They began a systematic search of the property, looking for matches, chemicals, or hidden devices that could explain the sudden ignitions. They found nothing. They interviewed the family separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They found none. The fear in the eyes of the McDonalds was genuine. They were people who were watching their livelihood and their sanctuary be destroyed by something they could not name. The investigators themselves became witnesses. During their stakeout of the property, officers observed the phenomena firsthand. One report details an officer standing guard in the kitchen, watching the room with a hawk's eye to catch the arsonist in the act. While he stood there with the entire family in his field of view, a fire erupted on the wall behind him. He spun around to see the wallpaper blistering and blackening. There was no one near it. The fire was put out and the wall was examined. It was cold to the touch surrounding the burn mark. There was no chemical smell, no residue of oil or gasoline. It was simply spontaneous combustion of the paper. The officers were baffled. They had arrived to make an arrest and were instead left questioning the basic laws of physics. The reports they filed were filled with hesitant language, a struggle to describe events that professional law enforcement training had not prepared them for. The focus of the investigation eventually turned toward the adopted daughter, Mary Ellen. In the lore of poltergeist phenomena, it is often a young person in the household who acts as the epicenter, and the investigators noted that the fires seemed to happen most frequently when she was present or nearby. However, this observation did not solve the mystery. It only deepened it. Even if she was the focus, the mechanics of the fires remained impossible. She was observed closely, often seated in the center of a room with her hands visible, and yet fires would start in the corners of the ceiling or in adjacent rooms. If she was causing them, she was doing so without physical contact and without any incendiary devices. The suggestion that she was responsible was floated, but the lack of evidence for how times she was doing it left the case in a state of limbo. She was not a magician, she was a farm girl with no history of pyromania or technical knowledge of delayed ignition. The psychological impact on the community was profound. The McDonald farm became a place to be avoided. The road leading to the property was shunned by locals who feared that whatever was happening there might follow them home. The darkness of the winter nights seemed to press closer to the houses in Caledonia Mills. People began to lock their doors earlier, lighting extra lamps and gathering their families close. The story of the fire spook, as it came to be called, spread throughout the province. It was covered in regional newspapers, which treated it with a mix of sensationalism and genuine alarm. Reporters who ventured to the site described a family on the brink of collapse. Alexander MacDonald, once a sturdy and confident farmer, was reduced to a shell of a man, his face gaunt from lack of sleep, his hands blackened with soot, his eyes darting to every shadow. The climax of the events came when the family could simply no longer sustain the defense of their home. The fires had become too frequent, the activity too aggressive, the house was scorched and water damaged, smelling of wet ash and fear. They made the difficult decision to abandon the property. This was not a decision made lightly. To leave the farm was to leave their livelihood, their history, and their stability. They packed what they could salvage and moved out, seeking refuge with neighbors and relatives. The house stood empty, a dark monument to the unexplained. Interestingly, once the family vacated, the intense activity within the house ceased. The fires stopped starting on their own. The sounds of heavy footsteps and crashing objects faded into the silence of the abandoned structure. It was as if the energy required the presence of the family to manifest. However, the aftermath was not a clean break. The investigation continued in a desultory fashion. Mary Ellen was eventually taken into the care of authorities and later placed in an asylum, a common and tragic solution for the time when society faced behaviors or phenomena it could not explain. She was subjected to the scrutiny of doctors and alienists who sought to find a medical or psychological reason for the events. They probed her mind, looking for hysteria or malice. While they could label her, they could never explain the physical evidence left behind at the farm. The braided tails, the burns in high corners, the moved furniture that weighed hundreds of pounds. The official explanation drifted toward a vague consensus of mischief, but the label felt hollow to anyone who had actually stood in that kitchen and watched the walls catch fire. The McDonald farmhouse remained standing for years, slowly deteriorating under the weight of the seasons. It became a local landmark of fear, a place where teenagers would dare each other to go, but few lingered. The stories of what happened there were passed down through the generations in Antigonish County. It wasn't a story of a ghost in a white sheet. It was a story of a raw, destructive force that dismantled a family's life piece by piece. The lack of a clear resolution, no fraud exposed, no natural cause identified, left a scar on the local psyche. It was a reminder that the safety of a home is an illusion, that the walls we build to keep the weather out cannot protect us from forces that seem to originate from within the very air we breathe. Researchers who have looked back at the case in later decades have often compared it to other famous poltergeist cases, noting the similarities in the rain of stones, the water manipulation, and the fires. The Caledonia Mills case stands out, however, for its rural intensity. There were no city lights to dilute the darkness, no nearby police station for quick response. The family was alone with the phenomenon in a way that modern urban victims are not. The isolation amplified the terror. When the fires started, there was no fire department to call. It was just Alexander and his bucket of water against an entity that could ignite the wood as fast as he could douse it. The survival aspect of the case is often overlooked. The family managed to survive weeks of a siege that could have easily resulted in the house burning down around them while they slept. The skepticism that usually accompanies such stories was present, of course. People in distant towns called it a hoax. They claimed Alexander did it for insurance, though he lost his home and gained nothing. They claimed Mary Ellen did it for attention, though she ended up institutionalized and outcast. These explanations, while comforting to the rational mind, failed to account for the testimony of the police officers. These were men who had no reason to lie, no reason to ruin their own reputations by filing reports about ghost fires. Their accounts remain the most disturbing element of the historical record. They provided a verified, third-party confirmation that something impossible was occurring. They did not find wires, they did not find chemical accelerants. They found a house that was attacking its inhabitants. One particular incident that stands out in the archival records involved a specific inspection by a detective from Halifax. He had arrived with the intent of exposing the fraud. He was a man of science and law, cynical by nature. He spent a night in the house, sitting in the parlor with a clear view of the hallway. He later recounted that while he was watching the empty stairs, he heard the distinct sound of someone walking down them. The tread was heavy, the wood creaking under the weight. He stood up, shining his light on the staircase. It was empty. As he watched, the sound continued past him, invisible, and then the heavy front door unlatched itself and swung open into the snowstorm. He rushed to the door. There were no footprints in the fresh snow on the porch. The detective left the next morning, his report inconclusive, his skepticism shattered by the undeniable reality of his own senses. The tragedy of the MacDonald family is that they were regular people, thrust into a narrative they did not choose. They were not occultists, they were not seeking fame, they were farmers trying to survive a winter. The events at Caledonia Mills destroyed their unit. Alexander never truly recovered from the stress of those weeks. The loss of his home and the cloud of suspicion that hung over his name took a toll on his health. The community, while initially helpful, eventually pulled away, the stigma of the haunted farm proving too strong for social bonds to withstand. It is a common pattern in these cases. The victims are victimized twice, first by the phenomenon and then by the society that cannot process the anomaly. Decades later, the site of the farmhouse has been reclaimed by nature. The trees have moved back in, the foundations have crumbled into the soil, and the physical evidence of the fires has long since rotted away. But the accounts remain in the archives of Nova Scotia folklore and in the dusty police files of the era. They serve as a testament to the fact that there are pockets of experience that defy explanation. The Caledonia Mills mystery was never solved in the traditional sense. It simply stopped when the fuel the family was removed. It remains a disturbing example of how fragile our grip on reality can be and how quickly the familiar comforts of a home can be transformed into a landscape of absolute terror. The enduring question of the Caledonia Mills fires is not just how they started, but why. Was it an external entity? Was it a manifestation of the subconscious stress of a teenager? Or was it something geological, a magnetic or electrical anomaly of the land itself? Theories abound, but none satisfy the entirety of the facts. The wet towels that burned, the cold walls that scorched, the invisible walkers, these details refuse to fit into a neat box. The case sits in the history books as an uncomfortable silence, a gap in the rational narrative of the province. It is a story that is whispered rather than shouted, a reminder that in the deep woods of the north, in the dead of winter, there are things that burn without a match and walk without feet. Even today, those who drive through the back roads of Antigonish County might feel a shiver when passing near the old location. The geography hasn't changed. The wind still howls through the spruce trees with a voice that sounds almost human. The isolation is still there, waiting. For the McDonalds, that isolation turned into a prison. Their story is a sobering documentation of a family under siege fighting a battle against the impossible, armed only with buckets of water and prayer. It is a raw, unfiltered glimpse into a reality where the rules of physics are temporarily suspended and where the dark corners of a room can hold more than just shadows. The final aspect of the case that lingers is the silence of the aftermath. After the family left and the sensation died down, the world moved on. The 1920s roared into the 1930s, the Depression hit, and the small tragedy of a burning farmhouse was largely forgotten by the wider world. But for the people who were there, who smelled the smoke and felt the cold draft of the invisible opening doors, the memory never faded. It was a trauma etched into their minds. They had seen the veil lift just for a moment, and what they saw behind it was a chaos that had no place in their ordered lives. The MacDonald farm haunting remains one of Canada's most compelling and least understood mysteries, a cold case in the truest sense of the word, frozen in the ice of a 1922 winter, forever unresolved. The unseen fires of the Dag Farm. The Ottawa Valley sits along the border of Quebec and Ontario, a region defined by its dense woodlands, rolling farmlands, and the kind of isolation that feels absolute once the sun goes down. In the late 19th century, specifically in the year 1889, the township of Clarendon was a quiet agricultural community where reputation meant everything. It was a place where neighbors relied on one another for survival during the harsh Canadian winters, and where gossip traveled faster than the mail coach. But what happened at the farmhouse of George Dagg that autumn was not the sort of thing people wanted to discuss in the open. It was a sequence of events that defied the physics of the time and the logic of the people who lived there, leaving behind a stack of sworn affidavits and a legacy of uneasy silence. George Dagg was a modest farmer, a man known for his hard work and his lack of interest in nonsense. He lived in a sturdy log farmhouse with his wife Susan and their two young children, Mary and Johnny. Also living with them was a young girl named Dinah McLean. Dinah was an orphan, 11 years old, who had been taken in by the Dagg family to help with chores and to be raised alongside their own children. It was a common arrangement at the time, functioning somewhere between adoption and servitude, though by all accounts, Dinah was treated well. The household was typical for the era, focused on the daily grind of preparing for the upcoming winter. There was no history of mental illness in the family, no prior reports of strange occurrences on the land, and no reason to suspect that their lives were about to be dismantled by something they could not see. The disturbance began on a Sunday morning, the 15th of September. It did not start with a crash or a scream, but with something far more irritating and confusing. Susan Dagg walked into the kitchen to find a puddle of milk on the floor. It wasn't a spill that looked like an accident, but rather as if a jug had been deliberately overturned. She cleaned it up, assuming one of the children had been careless and was afraid to admit it. But later that same day, she found a jar of pickles shattered in the pantry. The shards of glass were scattered in a way that suggested force, yet no one had been in the pantry. The family dismissed it as a draft or a shelf giving way, the kind of rationalization people make when they want life to remain normal. The following morning, the situation escalated from accidental breakages to something distinctly aggressive. As the family sat down for their midday meal, a smear of filth appeared on the wall. It was wet manure, fresh from the barnyard. Susan was horrified. She accused the children, who vehemently denied it. While she was scrubbing the wall, another glob of manure struck the window from the outside. George ran out to catch the prankster, convinced that a neighbor's child or a vagrant was messing with them. He circled the house, checked the bushes, and scanned the open fields. There was no one. The land was empty. When he returned inside, he found his wife standing in the center of the kitchen, pointing a shaking finger at the floor. While he was outside, a jug of water had lifted itself from the table and emptied its contents onto the floorboards before rolling to a stop. Over the next 48 hours, the farmhouse became a chaotic environment of flying objects and unexplainable messes. The Dag family could barely eat or sleep. Stones from the driveway began to pelt the roof, creating a deafening rhythm that lasted for hours. These weren't small pebbles, but fist-sized rocks that would have required a strong arm to throw. George, now fearing for the physical safety of his family, enlisted the help of his neighbors. He assumed that if he had more eyes watching the property, they would catch the culprit. It was a logical plan for a problem that he still believed had a human origin. Several men from nearby farms arrived, armed with shotguns and lanterns, ready to catch a trespasser. Instead, they became witnesses to the impossible. One of the neighbors, a man named Arthur Smart, was standing in the kitchen when he saw a large stone crash through the window pane. The glass shattered inward, spraying across the table. Smart rushed to the broken window and looked out. The yard was clear. The angle of the throw suggested someone standing directly in front of the window, yet the space was vacant. As the men debated what they had seen, a second stone flew through the same broken pane, landing with a heavy thud near the stove. This stone was dry and warm, while the stones in the yard were damp from the morning frost. The men picked it up, passing it around, trying to find a wire or a string, anything that could explain how it had entered the room with such velocity. There was nothing. The psychological toll on Dinah, the young orphan, was becoming apparent. The phenomena seemed to center around her. When she entered a room, the activity spiked. Objects would fly off shelves as she passed. Chairs would tip over as if pushed by an invisible hand when she sat down. The neighbors noticed this pattern quickly. In the superstitious climate of the 19th century, whispers began to circulate that the girl was doing it herself, perhaps through some sleight of hand or trickery. To test this theory, George and the neighbors conducted a series of rigorous experiments. They had Dinah sit in the center of the room, her hands visible on her lap, while observers stood in every corner. During one of these observations, a heavy iron pot lid spun off the stove and clattered across the floor, stopping at Dinah's feet. No one had been near the stove. Moments later, a wash basin filled with water flipped over on the washstand, soaking the floor. Dinah had not moved. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was not enjoying the attention. She was terrified by it. The men who had come to expose a prankster were now forced to confront the reality that something else was happening, something that had no place in their understanding of the world. The local magistrate was notified not to file charges, but because the community simply didn't know who else to call when a house seemed to be under attack. The activity shifted gears again in early November, moving from kinetic energy to something far more dangerous: fire. It started with small scorch marks appearing on the wallpaper. Then, the curtains in the parlor ignited spontaneously. There was no spark, no match, and no open flame nearby. The fabric simply burst into fire. The family rushed to beat out the flames with rugs. No sooner had they extinguished one fire than another started in the bedroom upstairs. George Dag found his bedsheets smoldering. The smell of smoke became a permanent fixture in the house. They began keeping buckets of water in every room, living in a constant state of high alert. The fires were peculiar. They didn't burn with the intensity of a normal fire initially. They seemed to start slowly, almost hesitantly, before flaring up. Witnesses described seeing a flash of light, like the strike of a match, but without the match itself. On one occasion, a piece of paper lying on the dining table curled up and blackened right in front of the local schoolteacher who had come to see the events for himself. He watched as the edges turned to ash and the center glowed orange, all while the paper remained completely isolated from any heat source. He later wrote a testimonial stating that he had gone to the Dag farm, a skeptic, and left convinced that powers unknown to science were at work. Word of the Dag haunting spread to the nearby towns and eventually reached the ears of Percy Woodcock, a well-known artist and something of an amateur investigator of the unexplained. Woodcock was an educated man, articulate and observant, and he decided to travel to Clarendon to document the case. He wasn't interested in rumors, he wanted empirical evidence. He arrived at the farm in mid-November, bringing with him a notepad and a healthy dose of critical thinking. He expected to find a hysterical family and a lot of natural explanations. What he found was a household under siege. Woodcock's arrival marked a turning point in the documentation of the case because he treated the investigation like a scientific inquiry. He interviewed the family members separately, cross-referencing their stories. He examined the broken windows, the scorch marks on the floor, and the trajectories of the thrown stones. He quickly realized that the sheer volume of incidents made fraud unlikely. There were simply too many events happening too quickly, often in different rooms simultaneously. One afternoon, while Woodcock was sketching in the parlor, he witnessed a large, jagged rock float through the air. It didn't fly as if thrown, it drifted, hovering for a moment before dropping vertically onto the floor. It was a movement that defied gravity and momentum. The most chilling aspect of the haunting, however, was not the fires or the stones, but the voice. It began as a guttural sound emanating from the empty air in the woodshed. At first, it was just groans and heavy breathing, sounds that made the hair on the back of George's neck stand up. But soon, the sounds formed into words. The voice was deep, raspy, and distinctly masculine. It didn't sound like anyone in the family, and it certainly didn't sound like the 11-year-old Dinah. It would shout obscenities, hurl insults at the neighbors, and make crude jokes. The source of the voice was impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to come from the walls, the floor, or the thin air itself. Woodcock, demonstrating a remarkable amount of courage, decided to engage the voice in conversation. He went into the woodshed, the epicenter of the vocal phenomena, and asked who it was. The voice responded with a stream of profanity. Woodcock persisted, asking questions about why it was there and what it wanted. The entity, if that's what it was, seemed intelligent. It knew the names of the neighbors. It knew secrets about the townspeople that Dinah could not possibly have known. It mocked their clothes, their habits, and their fears. It was a psychological violation that terrified the community more than the fires ever did. A fire you could put out with water. A disembodied voice knowing your darkest secrets was a different kind of threat. The interactions with the voice became a bizarre spectacle. People would crowd into the shed, listening as the empty air debated with them. One specific incident involved a skeptic who accused the voice of being a ventriloquist's trick. The voice laughed, a dry, mirthless sound, and told the man to check his pockets. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a handful of silver coins he had verified were there minutes before, only to find them bent and twisted as if crushed by a vice. He dropped the coins and fled the property, refusing to return. The physical strength required to bend silver coins with bare hands was immense. For an invisible force to do it inside a man's pocket was incomprehensible. As the weeks dragged on, the phenomena began to take a toll on Dinah's health. She was exhausted, pale, and losing weight. The family debated sending her away, thinking that perhaps her departure would end the torment, but they were also protective of her. They knew that if they sent her to an orphanage or another home, the curse might follow her, or worse, she would be treated as a pariah. They chose to keep her, enduring the chaos together. It was a testament to the family's loyalty, even as their house was being dismantled piece by piece. The windows were boarded up because they had all been smashed. The furniture was scarred from burns and impacts. The farmhouse, once a symbol of stability, looked like a war zone. One evening, the voice changed its tone. It stopped swearing and began to sing. It wasn't a crude barroom song, but a hymn. The transition was jarring. The deep, raspy voice belted out religious verses with perfect pitch, resonating through the wooden structure of the shed. Woodcock listened, mesmerized. He asked the voice why it was singing. The response was cryptic, something about time running out. The entity claimed it was not a devil, but a wandering spirit that had been wronged. This shift from aggression to melancholy confused the witnesses. It made the entity seem less like a monster and more like a tragedy, though the family remained too terrified to feel much sympathy. Woodcock decided to try a final experiment. He wrote a message on a piece of paper, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it on a high shelf in the shed where no one could reach it without a ladder. He asked the voice to read what was inside. For several minutes, there was silence. Then, the voice spoke the words Woodcock had written, verbatim. It was a phrase about truth and light. Woodcock retrieved the envelope. It was still sealed. There were no hidden mirrors, no accomplices. He was the only one who knew what was on that paper. This confirmation of clairvoyance or remote viewing cemented his belief that the phenomenon was genuine and external to the little girl. The climax of the haunting occurred in late November. The house began to shake violently, as if an earthquake were localized entirely under the foundation. Crockery rattled off the shelves, pictures swung wildly on the walls, and the family huddled together in the center of the kitchen, praying. The noise was deafening, a mixture of banging, scratching, and that deep, resonant laughter. It felt like a finale. The energy in the house was electric, the hair on their arms stood up, and the air felt thick and charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. In the days that followed, the activity decreased rapidly. The fires stopped, the stones ceased to fly, the voice, once a constant tormentor, became a whisper, then faded into nothingness. By December, the Dag farm was quiet. The snow had come, blanketing the scorched earth and the broken glass. The family waited for the next shoe to drop, for the next fire to start, but it never did. The entity, or whatever force had occupied their home for 3 months, had simply moved on or dissipated. The abrupt ending was almost as unsettling as the haunting itself. There was no exorcism, no grand banishing ritual, just a sudden withdrawal of the energy that had plagued them. The aftermath of the Dag mystery was a quiet retreat into normalcy. George Dag repaired the windows and repapered the scorched walls. He didn't like to talk about what had happened. He wanted his farm to be known for its crops, not its ghost. Dinah McLean grew up, eventually married, and moved away. She rarely spoke of the events of 1889, and when she did, it was with a sense of detachment, as if she were describing a bad dream she had once had. The neighbors who had signed affidavits and sworn on Bibles about the flying stones and the fires eventually stopped telling the story at gatherings. It was too strange, too uncomfortable, and as the years passed, it became easier to pretend it had been an exaggeration. Percy Woodcock, however, did not let it go. He published his account, detailing the events with the precision of a courtroom stenographer. His report remains one of the most compelling documents of paranormal activity in Canadian history because of its lack of sensationalism. He didn't try to sell a book or become famous, he simply recorded what he saw. He described the flight paths of the stones, the temperature of the fires, and the timbre of the voice. He concluded that while he could not explain the source of the phenomena, he could state with absolute certainty that it was not a hoax. The physical evidence, the broken glass, the burns, the bent coins, was irrefutable. The Dag farm incidents left a lingering question about the nature of the reality the family inhabited. The phenomena had been witnessed by dozens of people, from uneducated farmhands to skeptical magistrates and artists. They had all seen the same things. They had all felt the same fear. Yet, without a body to bury or a criminal to jail, the event slipped into the gray area of history. It became a story told to frighten children, stripped of its nuance and its terror. Looking back at the records, the most disturbing element is the senselessness of it all. There was no clear motive. The entity didn't seem to want anything specific other than to cause chaos. It broke things, it burned things, it shouted abuse, and then it left. It was a raw, elemental outburst of energy that targeted a mundane family in a mundane house. It suggests that the barrier between the normal world and the inexplicable is thinner than we like to admit, and that it can be breached not by a ritual or a dark deed, but simply by bad luck. Today, the location of the Dag Farm is quiet. The original log house is gone, replaced by time and modern development. The fields are still there, yielding their harvest as they did in 1889. But in the local archives, the sworn testimonies remain. They are yellowed and brittle, covered in the looping script of the 19th century. They tell the story of a winter when the laws of nature were suspended for a quiet family in the Ottawa Valley, and they stand as a permanent, uncomfortable reminder that we do not always understand the houses we live in or the air we breathe. The fires are out, but the history of the heat remains.